Alright, welcome back to the Wild Table. Today we're going to bring to you a really simple instructional video on how to sharpen your knife. Alright, before we get into the actual sharpening aspect of this video, I just want to really briefly mention three fairly distinct type of blades or knives that you might be picking up from a hunting store. This here is my ESE utility knife. Okay, while we can achieve a really good level of sharpness on this knife, it's quite simply a little bit too thick to be used as a hunting or butchering knife. So this is a really good outdoor utility knife, but it's not suitable for butchering or field dressing your animals. Secondly, this is the knife that I typically carry with me when I go hunting. It's a Canadian style hunting knife. It's made from stainless steel. We're able to achieve a really good level of sharpness on this blade, and it has a gut hook at the end, which is a feature that really comes in handy sometimes for butchering specific animals. Thirdly, this is a New Zealand made sword knife. Now this here is what I'm particularly fond of. It's carbon steel, okay, which basically means that it'll rust much easier than stainless steel, but it'll retain a much better edge than stainless steel. So this here is the knife that I use for butchering. It really pays to understand what different style of knives and blades are suitable for what purpose, especially if you're a beginner hunter and you're just trying to think about what it is that you need to get for yourself to get into hunting and butchering. Before we get into the actual process of sharpening, it really pays to understand the difference between sharpening a blade and honing a blade. There are a number of really simple devices that you can get from a multitude of knife stores, hunting stores, etc., such as this one, and it is a Lansky product, which is what I personally choose to use. But this is a device used for honing your blade, which essentially really just means that you're fining up the very edge of the blade, the very tip of the blade. If you imagine it like the very tip of your blade being like a triangular shape, all you're really doing is you're just standing up a fine layer of metal at the very end of the blade. That gives you a razor sharp edge that doesn't last very long. So that is not true sharpening. This is a Lansky kit that I utilize, which has a number of different stones in it, and this is the kind of kit that you want for creating true sharpness in your blade. Out of all the different knife sharpening systems that you could get, this is one of the more basic ones, but to be honest, this works perfectly well for what I needed to do. This has been serving me really well for some time to create a really sharp edge on my knives. I'm going to show you how it operates, okay? So you'll notice that in this kit we have 4 different stones, well actually 5, but this one doesn't really count, it's for a different purpose. We have 4 different stones that are used for getting a true sharp edge on your knife. Also, as part of this kit is a little vise. Now this vise is key, okay? On the vise we have a number of slots that have engraved next to it a certain degree. That degree is what you need to select to choose what kind of finish you want on your knife edge. Right, there are 4 distinct angles to be selected from on this vise, and I'm just going to really briefly touch on each angle. Basically, 17 degrees is essentially good for kitchen knives and filleting knives. It's a very sharp edge, but it'll dull quicker. 20 degrees is the setting that I most commonly use. It's really good for your hunting and field dressing type of knives. 25 degrees is a little bit more suitable for your sort of general purpose utility knife, like the ESE knife that I showed you at the beginning of the video. And 30 degrees is what I personally put on my hatchet. So it's not really a degree that I'd be using for a knife that I'm intending on butchering or filleting or cutting anything with. So that's these 4 distinct angles that are engraved on this Lansky vise. Okay, so now I'm going to briefly talk you through the actual process. For the demonstration purposes, what I'm going to use is the sword filleting knife, the carbon steel. Reason being is because this knife in particular takes on an incredibly sharp edge that I just enjoy working with. So we have the vise. First of all, you need to open the vise up by the wheel and the little screw that's at the top, and then you insert the blade. You don't want to lock it too deep into the vise, because we want a little bit of space above the vise for the stone to be working. Then we're going to tighten the whole thing up. And what we're trying to achieve, by the time everything is ready for you to use, is essentially the blade is locked into the vise at the tip, and the gap at the very bottom is just ever so slightly larger than the gap at the top of the vise, only marginally so. But we don't want this gap to be closing up at the bottom more than it's close to the top. Now, as I mentioned before, we have 4 distinct stones in the system, starting from red, going all the way through to green, blue and yellow. The red stone is a really, really rough stone. This is what you would use if your blade was really, really blunt. Essentially what you're doing is you're carving out a new shape on the tip of your edge. The green stone, when you run your finger along it, you feel is a little bit finer. So this is kind of the next step in the process. Then we go to blue, and finally yellow is a ceramic stone. What you're doing by using these different stones is you're slowly but surely creating the shape on the tip of your blade that you want for true sharpness. Now, I keep my blades in really good condition as it is. So when I'm going to go through this process right now, I'm not going to go right back to the red stone, because all that would be doing for me is just destroying the blade as it is and restarting a process that doesn't need to be restarted. Which is also the difference between honing a blade and creating actual sharpness in your blade. If your knife is dull, you need to go through all the different stones in order to create that sharpness. But if your knife is already sharp, you can simply use a honing device or the last 2 stones to recreate that sharpness. So with the system, all you got to do really is, it has 5 rods clipped into the lid. You just simply pull one of these rods out, and then take your stone that you want to use, and we insert it into the blade. Now you need a flat surface to put it in. Okay, so I simply lay it on the top of the case, and then you tighten the screw. That way, from the top of the stone to the bottom of the rod, you have an even plane. Now, this is where the angles on the vise come into play. I'm going to insert the rod into whatever angle I really want to use. Okay, so on this knife here, as I mentioned before, I use a 17-degree angle, so I insert the rod on the 17-degree angle. And then when I lay it up against the blade, every time I do a stroke, it recreates the 17-degree angle on the actual blade. Now, this Lansky system is designed to use with oil. And you see it comes with this little canister of honing oil. There are other sharpeners out there designed to use with water, and I do have a water stone on my kitchen bench that I use regularly to sharpen my kitchen knives with. In all honesty, the reason I keep that stone is probably more so for nostalgic purposes. I just really enjoy that process of water sharpening a blade in the kitchen. But for true sharpness, this system with oil is the best choice you can make. Simply apply a couple of drops to the top of the stone, rub it in a little bit, and then it's good to use. Inserting the rod into a 17-degree angle, and I simply run the stone into the blade. Doesn't really matter whether you go front to back or back to front. Yeah. There's also the option of just using little circles. I kind of do a combination of both. I do broad strokes from top to bottom, always going into the blade. This is key, always going into the blade. And I also do a whole bunch of little circles. Now you can feel the degree of smoothness as you're doing this, and you'll notice that on a blunt blade it feels much rougher. And you notice that also if you're going through the process of going from the red stone all the way to the yellow stone, this process is going to start feeling really rough and then get finer as you go through it. Now this blade is already very, very sharp, so I'm just going to do a few strokes either side and then move on to the next stone. Now the last stone, which is the yellow stone, has the white stone glued onto it, which is ceramic. Now this is what I use most often because it is the honing stone of the kit. This is the piece that you use to basically just finish off your edge to a point that you just get the ultimate amount of sharpness out of the blade, ready for use. Okay, so I've taken the blade out of the vise. I gave it several passes with the stones, the last two stones, so essentially we've honed the blade. Okay, my test for true sharpness is simply this: I take the knife and I pass it through a piece of paper, and I try and cut some curves like a letter S or something like that without the blade catching. That tells me that I've achieved the right level of sharpness. See, no snags on the paper. If the blade does catch, I generally resharpen it to the point until it doesn't anymore. You want to pass it through the piece of paper and be able to turn the blade freely inside the paper without the blade snagging anywhere. Okay, I'm just going to talk about this little device here really briefly, okay? This is what I would take with me into the bush for field dressing or have on me when I'm butchering a deer in the shed. Now, this is a honing device. It is not a sharpening device. If you've got a dull blade, this is not what you want to have on you. But if you've got a blade that's already been looked after and sharpened properly, this is all you should need to keep it sharp enough to do the job that you need to do. It's got a little V right in the very top there. That little V has two rods that are made of ceramic, which is the same material that's on your last stone, the yellow stone in the larger sharpening kit. All you really need to do is take your blade and drag it through the V several times to recreate the right angle on the tip of your blade to keep it sharp. And when you're field dressing a deer or butchering a deer, especially when you're working around the bones, it really pays to have this on you and just drag the blade through that V 4 or 5 times every, say, few minutes, every 2 or 3 minutes when you're butchering an animal, especially if you've been running the blade against something hard like bone or antler. I hope that this video helped some of you guys to understand the difference between truly sharpening and honing a blade. And I think that it is imperative for any hunter out there to have some kind of a system organized that allows you to put a really nice sharp edge onto your blade. To try to field dress a deer or to butcher a deer with a dull blade is quite simply doing a disservice to the animal and to the meat that you're gonna take home.